Hello, everyone, and welcome. I'm Becky Robinson. I'm so thrilled to be here today with Sara Taylor, and we're going to get started with our event in just a few moments. We want to give you all a chance to come into the room. One of the things that we love to do here at Weaving Influence is to foster an inclusive community. So one of the things you might notice in the bottom of your Zoom panel is that we do have captions enabled. You can go ahead and turn those on if those would enhance your experience. We also would love to have some community in the chat. So we want to welcome you to go ahead and let us know in the chat where you're calling in from. And in the event that you are calling in today as part of professional development from your organization, we want to go ahead and invite you to name your organization. I'll try to give you a shout out in the chat. So we would love to hear from you in the chat as you're coming into the room. We have such a rich morning, afternoon, depending on where you are in the world of learning together. I guess it is the afternoon where I am in Michigan. Sarah, is it the afternoon where you are too?
It is, yes. I just put in the chat. I'm calling in from Santo Domingo, Dominican Republic.
Amazing. And it looks like we have some callers from lots of different places. So Joyce, we're going to shout out the Association of Regulated Nurses of Manitoba. Welcome. We also have Lady Powerhouse Solutions in Central Florida. So welcome to you. Sun State Equipment in Atlanta, Georgia. The University of Saskatchewan Library in Canada. A National Weather Service from Canton, Michigan. And the looks like New Hampshire, shoot, my jumped ahead. New Hampshire Department of Environmental Services. WI represent, oh, Pete is representing Madison, Wisconsin.
Madison.
And we've got some UW Madison folks. Let's see, Next Level Coaching and Consulting in Cocoa Beach, Florida. So another university person, University of Tennessee, Knoxville. So amazing that so many of you are joining us as part of your professional development. And it's great to see so many of you joining us today. Thank you for investing in this time of learning with us. Before we get too far, I want to introduce Sara Taylor, and you're going to notice that I have her book behind me here. Her new book, Thinking at the Speed of Bias, How to Shift Our Unconscious Filters, is launching July 9th, which means that you get a sneak preview of the content today, which is so exciting. And I am just looking forward to learning with all of you today. Wendy, my colleague, has put Sarah's entire bio in the chat. I'm not going to read it back to you, but I will mention that Sara has been working in this field for over 3 decades, helping organizations and individuals to be more effective and inclusive through her engaging diversity and inclusion trainings. She's the founder and president of Deep Sea Consulting, which is 20 plus years as an organization. And I have been the recipient of some of Sara's training because my team and I had the chance to do some of her on-demand training, and it was absolutely world class. So I'm thrilled to get to continue to discuss your ideas and perspectives today.
Yay. I'm excited too. Thanks so much, Becky.
For sure. We want to involve and engage you all at the start, and we'd love to know how familiar you are with some of the concepts in Sara's book. So I'm going to put up a poll, and we're curious to hear, as I mentioned, the title of Sara's book. Wendy, I'm having a tiny bit of trouble here with not being able to see this poll. So I'm wondering, oh, never mind, I found it. Yay. Okay, so here we go. We'd like to know how familiar you are with the concept of unconscious filters. I had mentioned Sara's book, and she's teaching us how to shift our unconscious filters. So are you unaware? Have you had some training? Have you read some articles and books, or are you very familiar with this concept of unconscious filters? So we'll give you a few more moments to respond to the poll, and then I'll share the results. So Sara, I'm guessing you've asked a poll like this before. What do you typically see?
Well, it really depends on if folks have had some exposure to deep sea and our work, because unconscious filters is one of the concepts that we created at Deep Sea. So it really depends on how much folks have already been exposed to us and these concepts. So Kind of depends on the audience. I'm really curious to see today.
Yes, I'm gonna end the poll, but I want to also mention that you began to share these concepts in your first book, Filter Shift: How Effective People See the World. So if you have seen that book, go ahead and let us know that in the chat. We'd love to know.
Yeah,
All
absolutely.
right, so here are the results. About 16% of people are unaware. 44% have had some training, 22% have read some articles and books, and 18% say they're very familiar. And I
Ah.
do have a question in the chat, Sarah, before we dive into our conversation, asking, is this similar to unconscious bias?
And you know, it actually, most folks think that it is not the exact same thing. Some similarities, but not the exact same thing. I actually created the concept of frames and filters a number of years ago to describe not only what our differences are, but also how our brain takes them in. And so it's not the exact same thing as unconscious bias because it utilizes more fields and more research. So the field of unconscious bias, in addition to the field of cultural competence, the field of psychology. So it is more complex than unconscious bias. And we could dig into that more too later.
I would love to. Well, why don't we start with defining these concepts that you're mentioning? So, what are frames and filters, and what role did they play in shaping our unconscious bias?
Absolutely. Our frames are the differences that we are conscious of, that we can recognize right away, and that are objective. They're actually very, very few. So for me, you see me, you see that I'm white, you see that I'm middle-aged, 57 proud years to be exact. Uh, you see that I present as a woman. If I were standing, you'd see my height of five. I used to always say 5'8", but we shrink. I'm about 5'7". You'd see those and you'd see my behaviors, but that's actually about it. You're really not going to know a lot more about me. Those frames, the things that we're conscious of that are objective. 5'7" is 5'7". That's all it is. There's nothing else, right? Our filters, on the other hand, are automatic mechanisms that operate in our unconscious that store our preferences, our perceptions, and our police, judge, and jury in forming our decisions. So much more, as I said earlier, much, much more complex than just the concept of unconscious bias. Hmm.
So, could you give an example of some of those filters, Sarah?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. So we'll talk in a bit about the different functions. Well, you know, I could just talk about them now. And in fact, I want to, for those folks that are like me, that are more visual learners, I want to share my screen. It always helps me when I know. So for any other folks that are more visual learners, let's talk about the three functions of filters first. A little bit later on, we'll talk about three types of filters. So our filters have been designed for eons to do these things. They have been fine-tuned and evolved to function in this way, perform in this way. The first is to take in exponentially more information than we can ever be conscious of. 11 million pieces of information, in fact, every second, yet we're conscious of only 40. So just incredible amounts that just go soaked right into our unconscious filters. And then it is our filters that categorize them, explain and evaluate, all just based on our own past experiences. So that explanation, evaluation of, I can see 6 people at a park, but when I'm telling someone about it later, what folks are going to hear are really coming from my filters. I tell someone, oh, I saw this happy family at the park. You should have seen them. They were so happy. Well, happy and family. I don't really know that they're a family and that they're happy, but that's what my filters told me they were. Really, all I know is that they're 6 people. So our filters are what are explaining and evaluating. And then it's our filters that decide for us, that decide, passing up to our conscious mind, decisions and perceptions that then form our actions. So very, very powerful if you think about it. First, with absorbing so much more, doing all of this analysis outside of our awareness, and then our thoughts are all coming from our unconscious filters. Very, very powerful.
That is super helpful, Sarah. And, it makes sense that we make these judgments or assessments and it happens somewhere unconscious. So I'm
Mhm.
wondering if you can talk a little bit more about the difference between the filters and unconscious bias.
Yeah. Yeah. So again, I created the concept of frames and filters to really help us understand not only what our differences are, but also how our brain takes them in and how our brain takes in, perceives, and judges. So as an example, let's just take that. Like I said, I'm 5'7". That's the objective reality. But it's your filters, if I were standing up, that would attach a value to that, that would say that's tall or that's short. Uh, we have the statistics that we frequently talk about when we're talking about the influence of filters, that we all know what's one or two frames that we see in Fortune 500 CEOs: male and white. Something like 90% of all Fortune 500 CEOs are male and white. In fact, you're more likely to be a CEO of a Fortune 500 company if your name is John than if you are a woman or a person of color. But the other statistic is that of those white men, something like 58% of them are over 6 feet tall, even though in the typical population, only 14.5% of us are that tall. So we have attached a filter of strength and some kind of good and professional and all kinds of good around being tall. So that's coming from our filters. The fact that I'm 5'7" is a frame, but how you're going to see that is coming from the perception of your filters. And same is true for differences that we have had so much division and have created so much inequity around. You see my color of skin, my race, as white, and likely, regardless of your race, your unconscious filters are going to say that somehow you're going to attach some kind of value to the color of my skin. That's coming from your filters. The color of my skin is my frames. Hopefully that helps a little bit more.
Yeah, I think so. And I see a question from Dan in the chat asking, how do filters relate to heuristics? I hope I'm saying that correctly.
Well, filters, again, are a term that I created to talk not just about what our differences are, and so many folks talk about our differences using the iceberg model as an example. And they just talk about, these are the differences you can see, these are the differences you can't see. And so filters are to talk about not just their differences. I have preferences that you can't see. You don't know when you see me that I prefer small talk in a meeting. And if you don't prefer small talk, that might get in the way when we're in a meeting. So you can't see that. That's really where we start to get into more of the cultural competence as well, the differences in our cultures, those differences in preferences, and again, perceptions that you can't see.
Thank you, Sarah. So I know that you created this filter shift framework that gives us 3 strategies to shift our filters. So see self, see others, and the see approach.
Mhm.
So can we talk a little bit about seeing others, and how can we practice seeing and responding to the filters of others, especially since you're saying we can't see those filters?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. So first of all, that progression is a progression that we all go through as we develop. Just as we develop from infant to toddler to preschooler, when we develop our ability to see and respond at the level of filters, we need to first see our own and be non-judgmental of our own differences, then see the filters of others, and then finally see how we approach situations and decisions differently. One of the tools that we use is what we call the active conscious process. And to get there, I want to just talk first about how our filters create our actions. So what we typically pay attention to are what is visible, what's external, the actions. So, or even someone's frame. So we see someone's color of skin, our perception of someone's gender, or a behavior that they exhibit in the workplace. And that's what we're paying attention to. But we don't realize that what created that action was a conscious thought. And what creates, remember, our conscious thought? Our unconscious filters. So when we look to changing, as an example, in the workplace, we want this behavior, that behavior, the other behavior, we typically don't think about and acknowledge the power of what creates those actions. And that's our filters. And for ourselves, our own actions are created by filters, whether those actions are equitable or not, whether those actions are respectful or not, whether those actions are considered professional or not. Those actions are created by our filters. Now, the important thing to think about with this process, just think for a second, of each of these three steps, if you will, which one could be missing in any given moment? It's the conscious thought. So we can go straight to an action without thinking. We even have phrases like, I don't even know what I was thinking, I just did it. Or rote cultural norms, if you will, that we just go straight to without consciously thinking about it. That's how powerful our filters are. They can determine how I'm interacting with you and how you're interacting with me. And so what we want to do to be able to really see others and see those actions, see those frames more objectively, is to have a more active conscious process versus this is the passive conscious process, where the conscious can kind of just serve as a rubber stamp, boom, right straight to the action. Instead, we want the active conscious process where we are recognizing how our filters just gave a judgment to that person's frame, to that person's behavior, and we want to challenge it. And when we do, and if you remember, what are those functions? The first is to take in information. The second is to explain and evaluate. So what we're doing when we stop and challenge in this conscious thought process, active conscious thought process, is we're looking for that explain and evaluation. So think about that 6 people again. I want to get to the place of I'm separating out the explanation that they're a family, the evaluation that they're happy. All I really know is that they're 6 people. Same thing when I'm looking at someone and my unconscious filters are attaching judgments to their frame. Oh, they're 6 feet tall. They must be this, that, or the other. Or, oh, they're this race or this gender or this whatever. My filters are perceiving that in one particular way or another. The active conscious process helps us to almost like block those biased pieces of information from getting over to our actions, helps us then to create more equitable decisions and behaviors. So
So I
this
wonder,
is what, yeah, go
yeah,
ahead.
well, I was wondering if you could kind of walk me through that a little bit, Sarah. So when we slow things down and we start to recognize how those unconscious filters might be causing us to create a judgment, like what do we do at that moment?
Well, the first piece is seeing that as, you know what, that's just coming from my filters. That judgment, then, I don't know if that's true. And just the fact of challenging it will help us to say, okay, is that truly what I want to think about this person? Is that truly how I want to respond to this person? So it can feel a little awkward, honestly, when we're first learning this, because, I mean, if you think about it, those two arrows back and forth, we end up thinking about what we're thinking about as we're thinking about what we're thinking about as we're thinking it. And it kind of could be this, but it's what we need to do to start really building that new muscle that expands how active our conscious can be.
Okay, that makes sense. And it seems like it's definitely gives us the chance to choose a different action.
Absolutely. You know, I just the other day I was using the example of, let's think of that again, filter to thought to action, and how there's sometimes it's just rote. Think about a time when maybe the power went out in your house and you knew consciously power's not out. You're walking around with the flashlight on your phone or maybe a candle or whatever. Yet you go into a new phone and what do? Your action. You go to flip the light switch. Even though you consciously know that there's no power that's going to flip on in that. So it takes a few times, right? It takes a few times to kind of like, oh, wait, there's no power. Oh, wait. Oh, the third time now. Oh, okay. Fourth time, I finally didn't go to flip the light switch on. That's exactly the kind of process that we want with our judgments about other people. Once we've gotten there a couple of times, it's like, well, wait, no, I'm not going to have that judgment. Well, wait, no, that stereotype isn't what I want to believe. No, 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 that's not where I'm going to go.
Mhm.
That's what we're talking about doing.
Yeah, that makes so much sense. And I'm actually thinking about a situation that got on a call with someone and I expected a certain type of person, and the person that I got was not the type of person I was expecting. And I had this moment of realization of like, huh, like I do have a judgment about this person based on him not being quite what I expected.
Yeah, absolutely. How many people said that after COVID? Oh, I'd never seen you in person. I knew what your face looked like, but wow, I didn't expect you to be short or tall or, you know, all of those kinds of things. Like I just didn't expect that. So that's all coming from our filters. Those expectations are created by our filters.
Hmm. Well, so could you talk to us about the three types of filters and how they might contribute
Yes.
to inequities in our worlds?
Yeah, absolutely. You know what? I'm gonna share my screen for this, and whoops, trying to share and then I end up advancing the slides. Hold on just a second. So there
No
are
problem.
three types of filters as well. So individual, group, and systemic. So I want you to think about this. First, let's just talk about the progression of the three. They go from more in our conscious to completely in our unconscious. So individual filters we can very easily consciously recognize, and group filters a little bit less so, and systemic filters are residing in our unconscious where we're not aware of them. They're also then from more to less easy to talk about, and from less to more judgment in many ways, and less to more impact on inequities. So let me just talk about each one of them. And I hadn't planned on sharing these slides, but I'm just going to go to another deck that I have to show a little bit more in detail about each one of these, because I think it's really important to understand how, particularly because in the field of unconscious bias, folks typically only talk about systemic filters. And from our work, we know that it's a lot easier for folks to learn by moving through from understanding individual filters, then understanding group filters, and then finally understanding systemic filters. So let me pull up this other slide deck here.
And I'm going to mention that in the chat while you're pulling that up, Sarah, people are finding a lot of value in the slides and asking about getting the slides. And we can cover that.
Absolutely.
Okay, absolutely. We'll get you the slides.
Absolutely.
There also will be a recording of this session. So if you're finding value in it, you can share it with others in your organization.
Yep, absolutely. Yep. So again, the importance, and one of the other things, if you think about that progression, and I think I can go back to that here. The other thing about the progression is the individual are easier for us to shift to other filters, shift to other perceptions, versus the systemic, again, easier to more difficult. And so that's why we start with the individual, even though they can seem very, very trivial. They don't tie to a particular group identity. So as an example, I mentioned earlier, small talk. Do you prefer small talk? Do you not prefer small talk? I will go into a meeting, and if I'm not thinking about it, I'll just go straight to small talk. And if somebody doesn't, and I'm not aware of my filters, my filters are going to start judging them. Or they're rude. Oh, they're this or they're that. They don't care about me in this meeting. All of that is my individual filters judging them and their behavior. So it doesn't tie to a group identity in the sense that you don't see, okay, so like I said, I'm a white woman and I prefer small talk. So it's not that 90% of white folks like me prefer small talk and only 10% of BIPOC, of folks that prefer small talk are BIPOC, or 90% that prefer small talk are folks that identify as women and only 10% identify as men. No, you don't see that tie to identity, which honestly is why it makes it more easy for us to talk about. So they can also seem pretty trivial. So when I start talking about small talk, people are thinking, well, what the heck? We need to get to inequities that we see, incredible inequities around race, inequities around ability, disability, inequities around gender, and so on and so on. Absolutely, we need to. But we're never going to get to those if we can't first talk about individual filters. So may seem much more trivial, but we also are more likely to have a conscious awareness of them. Ask anybody. I mean, just think for yourselves. Do you prefer small talk or not? Are you an introvert or an extrovert? All of those kinds of individual filters that really describe you, but they're not tied to your any kind of group identity. Still determining, like all of your other filters, though, how you're going to perceive and how you're going to show up. Again, they tend to be easier to discuss, which is another reason why we want to start there. If I'm not comfortable and my team isn't comfortable talking about individual filters, we're definitely not going to be comfortable talking about systemic filters. And they're also much less likely to contribute to systemic inequities. You don't see, as an example, look at a picture of all, I don't know, how many presidents of the United States do we have?
46.
46, 47. You don't see, oh, wow, 99% of them preferred small talk. Yep, see, I'm never going to have a chance. I don't prefer small talk. No, you don't see that. But you do with the other types of filters. Group filters, on the other hand, are tied to and reinforced by our group. These are more cultural norms and kind of just, the way we do things as a group. So one great example is the dominant US communication and conflict style is direct and emotionally restrained. And so what do you see? You see that folks can have a conscious awareness of that, conflict styles as an example. Yeah, I know that I'm direct. I know that I'm emotionally restrained, or vice versa. Yet, because it's seen as a norm, we still attach a whole lot more judgment to it. Well, that's the right way. That's the professional way. And then this is how you start to get a tie to systemic inequities, because you have organizations that have filter-driven cultures, not able to identify, aren't culturally competent, aren't not able to identify the filters that drive their culture. And so they create policies and practices that reinforce and perpetuate and sanction one particular communication style over another, one particular area of formality and informality, one particular way of being with time, and on and on and on. So that dominant group decides these are the rules because this is what we were taught is the right way, the professional way. So that's how they can begin to contribute more to systemic inequities. Let me just real quick go through the systemic filters. Those align with stereotypes. All of X group are lazy, all of Y group are smart. And we can have these perceptions and not have any conscious awareness of them. Remember that statistic I think I mentioned? Every second we take in 11 million pieces of information, but we're conscious of only 40. So I don't even know how many seconds I've been awake already today. How many pieces of information have I taken in that might even be stereotypical to my identity? Might even say that, I should be home. I shouldn't have a career. I shouldn't be a leader because I'm a woman. And I'm not aware of that consciously, but my systemic filters are holding on to that particular bias. So because it's residing only in our unconscious, it can be so much more difficult to address. We learn about these particular filters from the field of unconscious bias, and they definitely contribute to systemic inequity. So I'm just going to go back to, let's say, individual. Again, trivial. I'll give you two of my individual filters. I love purple. I love polka dots. So then a group filter. I'm a direct communicator. And as you can see, I'm emotionally expressive. And systemic. Like I said, I don't know, what information have I taken in that says to me, it follows the stereotypes, Sarah, you shouldn't be in the career with a career, you should be at home. So I've got individual, group, systemic. I go to an interview, someone's wearing purple polka dots. They are a direct, emotionally expressive communicator, and they are a man. And if I have all of those stacked up, they're going to be and I'm not aware. Wait a second. That's my filters that are saying, yay, happy thoughts because I see purple polka dots. Yay, this feels comfortable because they communicate like me. And yeah, I'm not even noticing that my filters are also saying, yep, they're the pick because they're a man. If I'm not noticing, I'm not aware of all of those, I may not hire the best candidate. I might just hire the filter fit. And who's it a filter fit to? To me. that's how you can see the tie to systemic inequities.
Wow, this is so incredible. So much information, super helpful. And I do have a question from Leah, and I think this is a question that goes back to when we were starting to talk about raising our awareness to filters. And she mentioned that it feels similar to cognitive behavioral therapy. And are there any roots in this framework in CBT?
Not necessarily in the therapy itself. However, in general concepts of psychology, absolutely. And how our brain works, absolutely. And I guess in some ways to CBT, in the sense that you're kind of challenging a bit your actions, but in a way, this is more I don't want to say more complex than CBT, because that's pretty complex, but because this brings in also the theories from cultural competence and the theories from unconscious bias. It gets at a different piece, and it gets at my behaviors that are contributing to equity or not, contributing to inequity or not, and being able to distinguish that difference.
Yeah, that's helpful. And I'm curious, for those who may have be listening from a marginalized identity, in what way like that might come into play with the filters as well.
Absolutely. And one thing that I want to just mention, when you think about dominant and marginalized, um, even just think for yourself. Are you a part of a dominant culture? Are you a part of a marginalized culture? Honestly, the answer to both is yes for all of us. We all have opportunities to be in both dominant and marginalized cultures, whether it is because of our religion, our age, our profession, our education, our race, our gender. Now, and on and on and on and on and on and on and on, depending on the setting. Having said that, some of us have many, many more opportunities to be a part of the dominant culture. So the real piece there is to really think about, when am I a part of a dominant culture that I miss these things? Because when we're a part of a dominant culture, we can have even more of that passive conscious process, because there are more filters aligned to our own filters. When we're a part of a marginalized group, it's easier to recognize when we're not a filter fit, when we're not a part of the flow, essentially, of that dominant culture. So it can be easier for us to identify. However, that doesn't mean that we have actually developed the ability to shift, challenge and shift our filters. And this is where the cultural competence field comes in. We know that across groups, whether a dominant or a marginalized group, pretty much consistently, regardless of our identities, the vast majority of individuals are operating at an ineffective stage, unable to fully see the complexity of our filters and challenge and shift them. So this is not about a process of, can I feel, have I felt oppression personally? And if I felt oppression, then I get it. Have I felt discrimination? And if I felt discrimination, then I get it. Absolutely not. It is, have I learned a new skill that we're not taught in school? A new skill that helps us to understand how our unconscious is playing with our conscious and skipping over our conscious mind to create our actions. And in that process, seeping through all kinds of biased information. Have I learned then how to catch that biased information and create more equitable decisions and actions? That's what this is about.
That's really challenging to think about. And I think it takes probably a lot of courage to admit to ourselves when we haven't learned those skills.
Absolutely. And I mean, if there were a fast food drive-through that we could all just drive up to and order ourselves some equity, order ourselves some equitable behaviors, we would have done it. And that's part of the problem is so many folks see inequity and want to shift that, but yet don't have the ability to do so. And it's not an easy ability, but it is straightforward. The process to develop this ability is straightforward, and it is an equal opportunity ability. Any of us can develop it. That's the good news.
That is really good news. So I want to ask one more question, Sarah, and then I know we're going to shift to a time that if our attendees have some questions that they want to put in the chat, we're going to go to some more of those questions. But I was wondering if you could speak a little bit to the idea of microaggressions. There are so many
Sure.
conversations about microaggressions these days.
Mhm.
And how are those, like maybe first, if you could define microaggressions in case folks on the call haven't heard that phrase used a lot, but I'd also be curious to hear how microaggressions may be like created by our filters or influenced by our filters.
Absolutely, absolutely. So I'm going to go back to that first deck that I have, and that gets at my definition for microaggressions. They are identity-based individual statements, actions that come from our systemic filters. And they can appear innocuous, even like completely something that's normal on the part of the sender, but they can create trauma for the receiver. The important thing is understanding that they're driven by those systemic filters, because those systemic filters, remember, they align with stereotypes. So I've got these stereotypes that have come in around whatever difference. I mentioned the ones around gender. Now, what's that going to mean? I may actually create some microaggressions around gender, around stereotypes around race, around stereotypes around ability, sexual orientation, whatever that difference might be. And so because that stereotypical filter aligns with stereotypes and creates that action that is traumatic, harmful to the receiver, and because it's aligned to those stereotypes, it reinforces this sense of otherness for that particular group. I'm the marginalized group that always gets. So you see patterns then that emerge, not only in the type of microaggression, but also the type of filter. I kind of call them filter fails. They're patterns of how our filters work, our systemic filters work, that can create certain patterns of microaggressions. So when we say, in our organizations, as many organizations do, many individuals do, say, you know what, we don't want microaggressions. So you know what, just go be inclusive and don't do those microaggressions. Well, all with the best intentions, right? But if it's our filters, and particularly our systemic filters, the ones that are the hardest to address, hardest to see, hardest to develop the competence to shift, if it is our systemic filters that are creating them, and we're not aware of that, we're not aware of how the patterns of filter fails that create the specific patterns of microaggressions, it's more difficult to just stop. So again, that can be a part of a developmental process that if I'm fully aware of my filters, it's easier for me to see those filter patterns so I'll give you an example. Associations, filter associations that say one group, like I said, all of X group are lazy, all of Y group are smart. And so then that creates patterns for X group and Y group. And those patterns are come out in similar patterns of behavior that, again, are traumatic for the individual, the receiver. It's
Thank you.
complex. It's
It is.
complex. It's yeah. And I want to also though give a shout out. Oh shoot, I hope I can remember here. This is what I was saying to you, Becky, earlier when we were in our prep. I was talking to my daughter before the webinar, and I'm like, okay, I gotta have my book handy. So this is an open book test. So if there's something I don't want to get the name wrong. I do want to give a shout out to a fellow Barrett Kohler author, Tiffany Jana, and she talks about microaggressions as subtle acts of exclusion. So that gets to that piece of trauma and the impact that it has on the receiver. It's a good thing it's an open book test
Yeah,
here.
so I have a question from Joyce, and she's wondering if the systemic filters for both the sender and receiver play a part in microaggressions.
No, it is really the systemic filter for the sender. And regardless of any filters on the receiver. So filters that I might have about a particular group. Remember, filter creates the thought, which creates the action. That systemic filter is creating my action towards that receiver. So it's all the systemic filters of the sender.
Thank you for that. So before we go to questions from our attendees, I am going to share my screen, Sarah, if that's okay. And I
Absolutely.
want to let folks know how they can learn more about you and your work in the world. And
Sure.
again, then we are going to go to some questions from our attendees. So as I mentioned at the beginning of the call, your new book is coming very soon. It is coming on July 9th, and it's currently available for pre-order. And not only is it available in pre-order if you want an individual copy, but if you would like to order in bulk for your organization, you are also able to do that at a discounted rate. So we want to encourage you, if the content of today's webinar has been helpful to you, to consider pre-ordering for yourself, your friends, and colleagues. Again, if you want to order for colleagues, there are bulk order offers available. The book, when it's released in July, will be available in print and ebook. You can connect with Sarah's organization, Deep Sea Consulting, to find out about those bulk orders. And if you would like to share the book with your online communities, we would encourage you to do so through your newsletter, email, blog, podcast, social media channels. And Wendy, my colleague, who's been such a great help on today's call, is going to put a link in the chat so that you can get some easy ways to share the book. More information and resources available at deepseaconsulting.com. And when you get there, you can also find Sarah's podcast, What's the Difference? And of course, always, we would welcome you connecting with us on LinkedIn, with Sarah, with me, with our community, and also with Deep Sea Consulting on LinkedIn as well. So if you have any questions about any and all of these resources, I'd be happy to answer them. But we want to encourage you to get involved with the release of Sarah's latest book. I did see a question also earlier from Namita, who was asking, are the books sequential? So does she, I'm guessing on the pronoun here, does she or her team need to read one first and then the new one after? Or can people get the new book and then go back to the first book?
Yeah, I would recommend reading Filter Shift, the first book first. There's certain concepts that I think are really good to know. Having said that, so there are some things in thinking at the speed of bias that I kind of just pick up from Filter Shift, if you will. And having said that, I did want it to write it as a standalone. So it's a both and, but of course, so let me say more completely, in our developmental work with our clients, we do use both. And we start with Filter Shift, and then we move to thinking at the speed of bias.
That's
Thanks
helpful.
for that question, Namita.
Yes, and there's a question here from Kate. Kate is wondering, how could we develop an awareness of filters in people of a younger age, like educational programs, so that people could become aware of these sooner?
Absolutely. So for younger people too, is the way I'm reading that. How can younger people understand this?
Mhm.
Um, it's really interesting, isn't it? That we don't teach this stuff in school. Um, and we don't give young folks the ability to develop this skill, yet even though it's such a critical skill. Um, I do think it does need to be included in educational processes. That would also mean that folks in schools, like any other organization, would need to be culturally competent themselves in order to teach, which I will say that was coming from Kate. I think, Kate, that in and of itself would create completely new educational environments. If all of the folks in our schools were culturally competent, um, that in and of itself would create a huge shift. Mhm.
Yeah, I totally agree. So Namita had a comment here that the leadership of the company that she works in is pretty nervous about doing DEI or unconscious bias stuff. And do you have any thoughts, Sarah, on how to make some movement if there's resistance to these concepts in an organization?
Yeah, absolutely. First of all, I know for us at Deep Sea, we come from the perspective of it's not about blame or shame, it's about acknowledgement and accountability. And so really understanding it as a developmental process. So it's not good people, bad people, mean people, nice people, racist, non-racist, sexist, non-sexist. It's about all of us are developing this ability and all in equal opportunity ability. So that helps to really address some of that resistance. The other thing is we can actually learn again from the field of cultural competence where some of that resistance comes from. And some of it is coming from a fact that we know about cultural competence, that the vast majority of us perceive ourselves as more competent than we actually are. So sometimes that resistance can come from a good intent of, I don't need this. I had that DEI program 10 years ago. I'm good. Yep. Good. Instead, it's, well, okay, you had that DEI program, that 1 hour training or whatever, but did you develop this ability? So understanding where that resistance can come from is also very, very important.
I know, Sarah, our team experienced an assessment that you do with your clients. And one of the things that stood out to all of us is the fact that there's a big gap between, like you were saying, how we perceive ourselves to be as it relates to our competence and how we
Yes.
actually are. And those assessments can sometimes open people's eyes to that.
Absolutely. And the other thing, let's go back to the education question that Kate mentioned. Imagine if we lived in a world where no math was taught. Some of us, just naturally learned a little bit more, but most of us were just kind of at a third grade level of math ability. And then all of a sudden, someday you're in your workplace and someone comes up to you and says, hey, there's this thing called math. And you're going to take an assessment and you're going to find out what your level of math competence is. That's essentially where we're at with cultural competence and this ability to recognize and shift our filters. We haven't been given that opportunity, and we don't know where we're at until we assess. Also, like math, just taking that assessment alone isn't going to make us competent. Also, like math, you have to do the work. You have to develop, and it's not going to be an overnight process.
That's a super helpful way of looking at it. And I think you're also saying that if that were true of math, we wouldn't be judging each other for how we scored on the assessment because we would be recognizing, well, we haven't been trained on this.
Absolutely. Yes. Yes, absolutely. Mhm.
Mhm. So, Sarah, one of the things I love that you teach about is the difference between the golden rule and the platinum
Oh,
rule.
sure. Mhm.
Would you share that with us?
Yeah, yeah. The golden rule, which many folks abide by, is to treat others as I want to be treated, which is, wonderful. teaches us to be respectful and so forth. But when we're developing our cultural competence and we move from see self to see others, we start utilizing the platinum rule, which is to treat others based on how they want to be treated. Because if you really think about the golden rule, it's based on a huge assumption that everyone in the universe wants to be treated exactly how I want to be treated. And that's the other thing, is that the golden rule reinforces our filters, because that's what my filters tell me too. My filters tell me behave in this way because that's the right way. Well, no, that's just the way that works for me. That might not be the way that works for you or for them. So the platinum rule helps us to really see how the filters of others, in order to respond the way their filters would like to be treated, essentially.
Got it. So I think I would have been doing well if I'd shown up in purple and polka dots.
That's right. That's right.
All right. So one more time before we end the call, Thinking at the Speed of Bias is available for pre-order. You can contact Deep Sea Consulting to find out about bulk orders and bulk order discounts for your organization. It sounds like what you might want to do is bundle Thinking at the Speed of Bias with Filter Shift. And you
Absolutely.
can find more resources at deepseaconsulting.com. So Sarah, as we wrap up this amazing hour of learning together, I know that you have some parting thoughts to share with those who are with us today, or for those who might be watching this recording later.
Absolutely. I would say, if I can't imagine that there's anybody that joined this call that isn't already aware of inequities, that really is frustrated at the very least that about the inequities that exist, infuriated even about inequities that exist. Well, good news is we all can do something about that. Just go back to those systemic filters. That's what has a direct line to those inequities. And so starting with the individual filters, the group filters, the systemic filters, we can eventually get to those inequities. That means we can all accept that accountability, take on that acknowledgement of our filters, accept that accountability, and we can all be contributors individually and in our organizations to greater equity. That's what this is about.
Thank you, Sarah.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for the opportunity, Becky. I very much appreciate it. And to Wendy for all of the tech support. Thank you, Wendy.